I'm Tom W. Smith from NORC at the University of Chicago, and today I'm speaking to James A. Davis. As a part of the interview in the AAPOR Heritage Interview Series, Davis has a long and distinguished career, including stints as director of the National Opinion Research Center, as founder of the General Social Survey, and as winner of the AAPOR Award for Exceptionally Distinguished Lifetime Achievement. But fortunately, I'm able to talk to Jim here today, and he'll be able to tell his story rather than me tell it for him. Jim, could you tell us a little bit about your upbringing?
I was born in 1929, as I recall, about 3 days before the big crash. I grew up in Chicago Heights, suburb of Chicago, Rockford, Illinois. Chicago Heights, actually, when I was about 6 years old, I published a newspaper, sold around the neighborhood. My partner was the well-known Washington columnist David Broder. He and I were best buddies. He once was quoted as saying, somebody said, David Broder is a journalist who writes like, no, yes, he's a journalist who writes like a sociologist. Jim Davis is a sociologist who writes like a journalist. That theme's going to run through it. Grew up mostly in Rockford, met Martha in 9th grade, and we are celebrating our 63rd wedding anniversary. At that time, I wanted to be a journalist very much. And in fact, I worked several summers for small-town newspapers, real old-fashioned newspapering. So ended up at Northwestern at the Medill School of Journalism. And I learned to write. That sounds odd, but writing is not a matter of inspiration, it's a craft. And journalism school, they teach you how to write. Put me in a room with a typewriter, not a computer, a typewriter, and an hour, and I will give you an essay on any topic. It will be clear, well organized, and all horse feathers. It's a technique, it's not a matter of inspiration. I was on the student newspaper, and a very important event, I was a humor columnist for the Daily Northwestern. It was a sort of a rip-off of the Pogo cartoon, animals and stuff. It was really hot stuff until after the first year, middle of the second year, I ran out of ideas. And I got an insight that in the newspaper business, you have to have an idea every day. In academia, once every 10 years will keep you going. So I got interested in academia. Actually, I'd taken, excuse me, a lot of sociology. And I was ill-advised to go to the University of Wisconsin, which at that time was not a great sociology department. Spent a year there and went to Harvard to study with Talcott Parsons, legendary sociological theorist. Got to put this carefully, a wonderful man, a great teacher, an excellent guru, but an awful sociologist. None of that rubbed off on me. Rather, I got to know a young assistant professor named Peter Henry Rossi. Oh, if we had a tape of Peter Rossi, but we don't. Peter was a legendary mercurial character and one of the most creative research people I've ever known. And the important thing is that he was a protege of the late Paul Lazarsfeld, giant of research at Columbia. And Lazarsfeld invented the, quote, Robin Hood theory of social research. Now, at that time, there weren't any real research centers like NORC. So an investigator would con somebody into the money for a survey and then tack some personal questions on. And Lazarsfeld developed a famous from scratch, famous research center called the Bureau. And Pete was trained at the Bureau, and I was trained by Pete. And this is the main shape of my career. It'll come up later. The heroic individual investigator who gets some money and then bends it to his will. Long gone. Okay, I finished at Harvard. There were no jobs.
Let me interrupt, Jim. Tell us about your dissertation at Harvard.
Oh, yes, I'm very proud of that. You're going to ask me sometime what my best things were. My dissertation was one of them. Sociologists go on and on and on about status symbols, status symbols. I wondered whether they worked. Did people pay any attention to status? So I collected a bunch of photographs of living rooms, interiors, and I showed them to people, and I asked them to guess the social characteristics of the people in the pictures. Brilliant. Finally got published in a minor regional journal, was never heard of again, but I think it was a great idea. So I finished thesis. I got a job at Yale. There weren't any jobs, so I was a, quote, medical sociologist, knowing nothing about it. And that was in 56, 57 sometime. There was a summer institute at NORC. And I came for the summer with a bunch of young, eager medical sociologists. And I met some famous people. Jack Ellenson, Shirley Starr, Jack Feldman. An aside on Jack Feldman. Jack is perhaps the brightest researcher I have ever met in my life. But he had a problem. He was uneducated. He had gone to an experimental high school, so he didn't have a high school degree. Went to the famous Hutchins College, where you went 2 years and got a degree. He didn't get his degree, so he went on for graduate school. He didn't bother to get a master. So in the roster of NORC, here were all these people with masters and PhDs and stuff, and Jacob Feldman, blank. Rossi could not live with that, so he instructed me to make Jack finish his dissertation. His dissertation was about medical research. NORC's always been very big in medical research, and something about health insurance or something. First line was, most people are fond of their like their doctor. This was followed by a footnote, about 30 pages long, going into the methodological issues of the question, do you like your doctor? And Jack tore it apart in terms of sampling, in terms of wording, in terms of this and that. Well, we hadn't even begun the text. We were on footnote 1. And I said to myself, this is going to be a battle. But I finally made Jack finish his dissertation, and he went on to become a real outstanding sociologist. Let's see, who else was there? Shirley Starr, a legend in her time, very much involved in the original Stauffer American Soldier Studies, which are legendary. Shirley was quite a character, not known for her diplomacy. Once we were trying to recruit a fancy business type for the business side, and we were wooing him, and he said something, well, this Hyde Park place, is it kind of dangerous? And we said, oh, no, 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 of course not. And Shirley, honest to the core, said, well, it's perfectly safe. I've lived here 20 years and nothing happened to me except for a rape. Dead silence at the party, whereupon Shirley said, no, 2 rapes. I don't think the guy signed with NORC, but Shirley kept her record for veracity. Jack Ellenson, did I mention Jack? Those were the stars at the time. Okay, I liked it. I liked a research center. I'd never really I'd heard about the Bureau of Columbia, but I'd never been there. And Yale didn't have any research centers. Harvard was not going to have a research center, for God's sakes, but there was a good one in Chicago. And Peter Rossi, by then assistant professor there, got me a job, assistant professor of sociology and senior study director at NORC, and that was, I guess, from 57 to 67. I'll beat you to it. What was NORC like in those days? It was very small. My standard story is that every morning, every single Chicago employee, including Elroy, the mail boy, very nice guy, had coffee in the director's office. We all assembled at 10 o'clock, had a cup of coffee, and went back to work. So it was a very small, intimate. There were no vice presidents. There was no human relations department. It was sort of a gang of senior study directors held together by a director, the late Clyde Hart, marvelous gentleman who was recruited during the war. He had taught at Iowa and went to Washington during the war, and when everybody regrouped, came with NORC to Chicago. Okay, my contributions to the science of humanity. I think my first big project was the so-called Great Books. That was a wonderful idea. The Great Books program, adult education thing, where groups meet and read Plato and Aristotle and stuff and talk about it. And they wanted money from the Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation said they had to be evaluated. They said, evaluated? That's vulgar. We don't do that. We're humanists. Ford Foundation said evaluate or die. So we evaluated them. Very clever design. We got, I don't even remember, 20, 50 groups, gathered their data, went back a year later to see if they were alive, if they had new members, and in those days, you didn't much care what the client wanted. I guess we found that the thing worked. But anyway, I got a book out of it about the life and death of small groups. It's called Great Books and Small Groups. And I think it's the best thing I ever did, and nobody ever heard of it. The big study in that period was the study of college seniors. Clyde always got the money. I don't think Pete was around by then. We got the money for a huge follow-up of thousands of graduating seniors. Wonderful sample. And we studied their careers and especially their funding, graduate students. I guess we started with graduate students and their funding, and then we did their senior year, how'd they get to graduate school. Produced quite a flurry of books and articles, really, really big time.
Was that spouses and stipends?
Yeah. You gave it away. That's how graduate students get through, with a stipend or a spouse who works. Okay. I was a busy bee, and I guess 66 one evening, I was sitting in the office, my office. Didn't have an office, sitting at my desk, and the provost of Dartmouth College, one Leonard Reeser, arrived and started sweet-talking me out of the blue. I didn't know him. I didn't know anything about Dartmouth College, but he was recruiting, and he sort of planted a bee in my bonnet, and it occurred to me that I'd always had kind of marginal jobs, health, sociology, but not interested in health, and study director, and so forth. I'd never been a real college professor. So he tempted me to leave NORC and go to Dartmouth College, where I was from 67 to 72. Dartmouth is a wonderful school. It has a reputation as an animal house, but the kids get marvelous education. And at that time, the president, the late John Kemeny, a giant of a man and a pioneer in computers, and he started to computerize Dartmouth. It was the first computerized computer-oriented college. And we became thick and developed the very first, I don't know anything about software, but a brilliant young man named Edmund Dean Myers developed a software program where from a teletype, not a PC, a teletype, you could type in a request and do data analysis. And we were probably the first college in the world in which our undergraduates actually began working with data. And some of it took. Bob Groves, recently head of the census, now provost someplace, was one of the students. Peter Marsden, now your boss at GSS, was one of the students. And working with data turns people on. So that was a great success. Then in '72, thank God I wasn't there, the directorship of NORC became vacant. Was Pete the departing director then?
I believe so.
And so they were looking for a director. And I had this wonderful idea. I would be the new Paul Lazarsfeld. I would develop studies using NORC and Robin Hooding foundations and people and make a brilliant career for myself and NORC. Didn't quite work out that way, but it turned out to be interesting. Well, anyway, when I was at Dartmouth, I had a great time. I really enjoyed the computerized teaching, but I noticed that I couldn't do research. There wasn't any research center, there wasn't any lab, there wasn't anything. So I got this notion and gotten in touch with Paul Sheetsley. Got to mention Paul. Paul was he was the head super study director. Actually, he was based in New York most of the time. Pete dragged him back to Chicago against his will. He incidentally came out of journalism too, and the old Gallup-style researcher. Well, I wrote him a note and said, I've got an idea. Oh, actually, the idea goes back to Herbert Hyman, famous social psychologist at Columbia, who had about the second best research design in history. He was interested in the racial prejudices of the blind. Now think about that. If you can't see what color they are, how can you be prejudiced? So he wanted a sample of blind people. Well, you can't. It is very expensive to draw subsamples of black people. You can't draw subsamples of blind people. But his idea was to ask Clyde to stick in every NORC survey question, by the way, is there anyone in the household who has difficulty reading or is blind? I don't know if they ever collected enough to do a study, but it's a great idea. And ding, 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 it occurred to me that for the people stuck in country colleges, if they would just stick 10, 15 standard questions in every survey, age, education, always worded the same way, race, etc., and collect those, you would have quite a data set of all the basic facts of American life. And I don't know if Paul ever did it or tried to get a grant for it or something. It was called 20 Questions. And the idea was in the back of my mind. Well, I came back to become the director of NORC. And I guess I can tell this story. I feel a little bit odd about it, but it is very important. I think it was the day I sat down, or 2 days after the phone rang. And it was, why am I blocking on? He was famous for blocking on names. Angus Campbell, the great man at Michigan. And he called me and he said, "Congratulations, Jim. We wish you luck. But there's something I have to tell you, that I have arranged with NSF to be their provider of surveys." I said, "Oh, well, thank you for your congratulations, and just see you around." Bang. And I had hysterics. Here was the only major competitor to NORC, very good people too, getting a monopoly on the market. So I spent a lot of money on airplanes and government offices. I tell you, when you get to a government office where they have flags, you're talking to really serious people. And I just raised bloody hell. You know, this is illegal, this is immoral, we can't do it, we're going to sue you, we're going to vote against, you know, and so forth. NSF wants to be pure, but they get spooked by Congress into being practical. So at that time, they developed something called, I'll get this right this time, RANN, R-A-N-N, not R-A-N-D, R-A-N-N, Research and National Needs, which was going to sneak practical research into the NSF basket, but without calling it NSF. So they kind of steered me to RANN, and we had long conversations. I came up with actually a very large program of research, one of which was the NORC General Social Survey. We also proposed, and I really feel bad about this, a parallel national sampling of 1,500 African Americans every year. Boy, if we'd had that from the 60s to today, but it wasn't funded. But some of the things were funded. There was a, quote, continuous national survey, which is nothing now, but at the time it was absolutely revolutionary. The survey always goes on. The phone people do 50 interviews a day or something like that. The data accumulates, and you can suddenly stick in a question. What do you think we should do about Iran or whatever? Run it until you got enough cases, and then stick in another. Oh, okay, I have to tell a story about that. How are we doing?
Doing fine.
The government was going to fund it, and of course, the notion was you'd have input from various agencies. Agriculture would have a question, HEW would have a question, et cetera, et cetera. And so we had a meeting to finalize it. And I explained what it was, and everybody said, "Hey, that's a great idea. We really could use that," and so forth. And then one of them said, "Okay, who's going to be the lead agency?" Dead silence around the table. Everybody was authorized to kick in money, but nobody was authorized to take responsibility for it. So everybody got up and left the room, and we had lunch. I think maybe a foundation funded it for a while, and now, of course, everybody's doing it. So anyway, we got a batch of programs from RANN. Terrible people, but a good program. And thus began the GSS. You want the history of the GSS?
Yes, we'd like that, Jim.
Oh, okay. At that time, there was a fad for, quote, social indicators. And this was kind of part of that fad. And the late O.D. Duncan, Dudley Duncan, the guru of quantitative sociology, had a smart idea, about as smart as the blind people idea. And he said, now we got to study trends, got to study change. If you start a study today and ask questions, you aren't going to get your publication for 20 years and you won't get tenure. But if you find someone has already asked the question and you repeat it, you already have a time series. Ding, 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 ding. We got some money from Russell Sage and a marvelous graduate student, Kathleen Schwartzman. It's something else, but it used to be Schwartzman. Actually, when I met her, she was working at NSF and then came to Chicago as a graduate student, and we made a deal that she would work for free helping us develop these questions, but if we got the money, she'd get the job. You knew Kathleen, didn't you?
Yes. Been at Arizona for many years,
Yeah,
University
I think
of
she
Arizona.
still is. I looked her up. So put Kathleen to work scouring mostly Gallup, but any place they could find decent national samples with questions hopefully replicated. And I think we came up with a list of 400 questions. Were you involved then?
No, that was shortly before my time.
Okay, now I can say anything. The project has had and still has a very plebeian, democratic, socialistic philosophy. This is for the common man. This is not for the hotshots. Which is one reason that the project has never had a major analysis section. Actually, the analysis section is asking the questions because we didn't want the users to feel we had creamed off the good stuff. Well, how do you know what the users want? You make a survey. So we sent this list of, I think there were 400 questions, to everybody. Department chairman, journal editors, people at summer institutes. There was one group of nuns at a Methods Institute at University of Indiana, etc. We got them all back. And the original theoretically driven design of the GSS is every item that got 2 ticks went into the GSS. And it is deliberately and has been general. It is designed to be of use to everybody. Downside, it doesn't have enormous detail on anything. Like we have them rate their health and so forth. We don't know if they have health insurance because there are huge studies that tell all the details about health insurance. So it has now there's some things like religion, social class, etc., where we got plenty, but for a lot of topics, it's deliberately thin. So the notion is that everybody would use it. The underlying notion was it would revolutionize sociology because sociologists, instead of going off in all directions, would have a common database to talk about. Ha ha, sociology went off in all directions, only one of which is the GSS. So we had this questionnaire, and we fielded. The first one, 72, was quite thin, as I remember. And from then on, it was 1,500 cases a year, and eventually, for economy, it kind of runs 3,000 cases every 2 years, plus or minus lots of things. Okay, the GSS started. Oddly, again, the plebeian notion, we couldn't get anybody to take the rap for it. I wanted the American Sociological Association to sponsor it for obvious reasons. They wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So we appointed our own board of overseers. Currently, NSF now recognizes that there has to be some external monitoring, and there's a very active board of 18 or so very prominent sociologists. So it consisted of me, and then by then you, Tom, and this board that met once a year and didn't actually do anything, and off we went. It has always been successful. And thanks to my questioner, I think the current data file has something like 5,000 variables in it. Over the 35, 40 years, there's only been one mistake that I know of, having to do with organizational memberships and so forth. every year I find something that's wrong, and I call them up and I say, my God, this is wrong. And then they check and they say, no, it's right. But we have an NORC, which has a superb reputation for craftsmanship. It is a very well done survey, always has been. Makes it very expensive, which is another problem. Okay, so off we went, never had any big problems. Usage, of course, started very slowly. It then boomed. We started keeping track of usages. Have we quit?
No, in terms of publication, we now know of over 20,000.
Need I say more about the general? I'm not saying they're all worth reading, but think what they would have been based on without the General Social Survey. So that's the GSS. Okay, in what, 6 or 7 years later? I can't remember. Oh, yeah, here we are. In '76, I went back to Dartmouth. A personal decision about which I do not choose to enlighten the viewer. I will say this, having grown up in the Depression, we never missed a meal, but boy, it hung over us. I am easily spooked about money, and having an administrative job where worrying about money, I would say not 12, but 22 hours a day, I didn't like. So I went back to Dartmouth. Although I maintained my tie, see, the thing is, GSS doesn't need me. It just goes on. Tom runs it, board meets, but I kept in contact and was heavily involved and was there for a couple years. And then I went to Harvard, where I ended up for about a decade. Personally and professionally, it was amazing. Harvard is just a fascinating place, but I don't think it's germane for what we're talking about. But in '94, I made a decision. I'd seen too many old geezers wandering around the Harvard yard being shaky emeriti, and I said, no, I want to leave them while they're still applauding. So I decided, it wasn't called early retirement, but I think I retired at 65 or something like that, just before Harvard cut back on its retirement benefits. Came back to Chicago. Norman Bradburn, who was on another one of these tapes, I don't know if he said anything about this, had the brilliant idea that I would become the training director of NORC. Very interesting idea, because of course there's no graduate PhD in sociology doesn't really learn a lot about surveys unless they're very specialized. So a lot of our people, NORC now being a huge organization, don't know anything about surveys. They just know how to do field work, how to do sampling, and so on. So Norman thought, or persuaded management, that there ought to be a training program, in-house training program on basic survey stuff. He brought me back to do that at a very handsome salary. And I taught part-time over at the university. Problem. When training is very important, but when business is good, you can't spare people to be trained. They have to get the damn study out in the field. When business is bad, you can't afford to have people trained because it goes on overhead. So I did virtually no training for almost a decade. Had a wonderful time. I fussed with the GSS. I did teaching, sort of hung around NORC. Well, one day I guess this was 1 or 2 directors ago, the director caught me and asked exactly what I did. Whereupon I retired from NORC happily, although I still teach a course a year at the University of Chicago. Your shot, Tom.
Okay, so you've taken us from the beginning pretty much to the present. If we look over this 50 years or so from the 1950s when you got involved in survey research through your period as director and then on now to the present, what do you see as the important changes in the business of survey research?
I thought you'd never ask. It is the rise and fall of the senior study director. In my time, surveys, big projects, were done by an individual as a kind of a self-employed shop. You get a grant, you might have NORC do the field work, or you might even hire your own field workers, but that was it. And that's all gone. There are no such people anymore for a couple reasons. One, the only serious surveys to be done are multi-million-dollar budgets done by the government. Government is not as dumb as you might think, and there are things called contracts, and they don't allow you to stick in an extra 6 months to work on journal articles. They want their tape, and they want the tape on a certain day for a certain budget. So the ability to Robin Hood foundations in the government and so forth is long gone. The surveys are done for non-researchers who have a question. But turning it around, nobody needs, oh dear, it's going to go on the tape, no academic needs NORC to do research in the way I needed it at Dartmouth because, well, first of all, it's a GSS. Want to do research on mobility? Get yourself a copy of the GSS. Want to do research on religion? Get a copy of the GSS. Plus 1 million studies, the panel study of income dynamics and adolescent health and so forth. So anybody can study almost anything without having a project of their own. So we are not training or grooming those people. Is anything lost? That's hard to say because the people of my era, since they were a one-man band, weren't terribly good at anything. I could give a 10-minute lecture on sampling, but I couldn't draw a national sample for the love of mud. Similarly, there was an awful lot of winging it, and now it's very, very, very professional. So you do not have people building careers around surveys in the way you used to have those people. Now, whether this is good or bad is very hard to say. I think I'd have to say it's just one of those historical changes in the social structure of the intelligentsia. So the major thing that has happened is the professionalization and organization of big-time survey research, of which NORC is the shining example. And whether that is, I think we had a great run, people of my era, but I don't see that there are people like that coming behind. my notes saying you forgot to ask me what my best research was.
I was saving that question. Jim, what do you consider your best research?
I thought you'd never asked. The Great Books book, I think, is one of the best things I ever did. Nobody ever heard of it. I think my thesis was one of the very best things I did. Then, at one time, I got involved in the beginnings of network theory and stuff like that, and I have an actual mathematical theorem, which is quite fundamental in network theory, about what kind of network properties it takes to divide into groups. People gone way beyond that, but that's a real honest-to-God mathematical theorem. And then, this January, I have an article in SSR which makes today, actually, if you get your New York Times out, I think yesterday, there's a big hoo-ha about why social science can't be a science because it doesn't predict anything, which made the people who analyze earthquakes kind of nervous. But there are lots of letters to the editor that have to predict. Well, in that article, I have a prediction. It's based on data from the GSS, and I predict that over 20 or 30 years, the generation gap is going to go away. Whether that's true or not, we'll know in 20 or 30 years, but it's an actual, honest-to-God scientific prediction, and I'm proud of that.
That prediction, what's the basis of that leads you to
cohort. The reason the older generation is the way it is because they don't have much schooling, much less schooling. They're all dying, and pretty soon everybody's going to have the same schooling, young people, old people, so educational differences with age will disappear. And since most of the so-called aging differences are really education, the generation gap will disappear. So if you want your money back, you can call in 20 years.
Right. So there's social change models. We're doing fine, Jim. So social change models, as you just referred to, education cohort being two of the drivers, and you're saying education is a big part of the cohort part of that. But let's look at the other part of that. If we look at Karl Mannheim's idea of political generations, you grow up in your late teens, early 20s, you're exposed to certain values, certain events, which have an imprint on you. Talk a little bit about how you think that affects societal change.
I wish that was true. If that was true, I could publish an article a day. But by and large, our experience well, back off a little. What have we learned about social change? In the attitude demographic type area, the big thing is cohort replacement, younger generations. There's a saying in science that science proceeds funeral by funeral as the older generation disappears and new one comes along. So the basic model is the effect of cohort replacement. And my experience has been, it has basically been because of education, just as I said, the big change in education. But time after time after time, if you run a graph with cohort going this way and something going that way, the son of a bitch is a straight line. There are no bumps. Famous instance of this, Howard Schuman and Larry Bobo, and folks have a classic study of white attitudes on race. Going back to early, NORC should be proud it was a pioneer of race relations studies starting during World War II. Well, anyway, they have all sorts of lines showing that racial prejudice has gone down like that. But there are no bumps for Brown. There are no bumps for the riots in the cities. There are no bumps for anything. They are just straight lines. So Mannheim's insight, of course, is correct, but it's hard to find markers that did it. You can't see, and you can see the effect of the generation of the depression on me when you talk to me, but you can't see it in cohorts. Cohorts, well, for one thing, were they born in depression? Did they grow up in depression, et cetera, et cetera. But my questioner knows more about this than I do, but I will go on record saying it is very rare you find a correlation. It's not rare to find cohort changes. There are lots of cohort differences, but it's very rare to tie them to particular events.
So obviously we've been talking about how the GSS is very important for studying societal change. As you've told us, the GSS has consisted of a series of replicating cross-section surveys. And that can be used not only, of course, to study societal change, but you refer to the study which you weren't able to carry out of a separate sample of African Americans, which you would have started back in the late 60s, early 70s. But talk a little bit about the ability to take and study subgroups across the GSS design.
Since the GSS is so large, and since the questions are uniform, very, very small groups pile up, in particular occupations. There have been studies of policemen by pulling all the policemen out of the GSS. At last count, the United States has 5,040 independent Protestant religions. You can study any one of them, provided they've got more than 2 or 3 members, by pooling them over time. So, oddly enough, while it is kind of big, it's also a very good microscope for looking at subgroups.
The original design of the GSS, which you've described to us today, of course, is a monitoring societal change design. What changes, what doesn't change, why it changes. But in the early 1980s, we added another dimension to the General Social Survey, the cross-national dimension.
Oh, boy.
So tell us a little bit about that.
I am ashamed. It's in my notes and in my heart. After the GSS got going, the idea is quite abstract. It could be done in any country, any kind of anything, any field of study, and it occurred. My questioner will have to help me. To Roger, or who thunk of the idea? You?
Well, it was, we collaborated first with what was then called Zuma.
Right. German and British and American and Australian were the originals. I can't say who, it doesn't make a difference who organized it. The first meeting was held in our living room in Cambridge, Mass. And it is very simple and very powerful. If you do a survey of a nation, and if it is of high quality, which is not true of every international comparative survey, and if you agree to do it routinely and agree to put the data in the public domain, you can either do it or hitch it onto your survey, and we now have at least 40, how many?
We have 49 active ISSP, International Social Survey Program members, and a total of 57 countries that have participated in one or more rounds of the...
And this is brilliant design because you have national variation and comparable measures in each country, and the data from Bulgaria are free because the Bulgarians pay for it. The data from Canada are free. All you have to do is get your own data And because of the National Science Foundation, the American data are free, so people all over the world, it really, why didn't, it's in my notes, it's in my heart, it is the GSS on steroids. And I think I should say, if I had one contribution to social science, participating in that would be one of them. What other important thing did I leave out?
Oh.
You mentioned a number of your personal, contributions, the network analysis, the societal change analysis. And let me just throw a few other things out. Exegesis. You wrote an exegesis, if I'm remembering the word right, of hierarchical log linear analysis. You were kind of a missionary for that new technique?
Yeah. Okay, this actually has been seeded in the interview with my journalism background, which I've got to say gets me in trouble academically. Journal referees do not like the articles I submit. But, quote, technical writing is something I'm pretty good at. There is a very famous sociologist, statistician named Leo Goodman. And got to go way back. The original surveys, for obvious reason, were done with tables, not with logit regression. Somebody told me at Michigan, when they calculated the first regression equation for the election studies, it took them 6 weeks. It takes my students 1 second. But before this, the only way you could handle data was cards on card sorters. I remember when at Harvard, I studied a little, not as much as you might think, with the late Samuel Stauffer, the guru of the American Soldier series. And he would stand in front of a counter sorter. You folks know what a counter sorter is? You have a card, it's got punches.
Sadly, I'm old enough to remember card sorters,
yeah,
yes.
The kids seeing this don't. You have a card, it has a punch. And if you're male, you punch out the 1. If you're female, you punch out 2. You whip them through a machine, and if there's a blank in 1, it drops in a pile. Okay, Stauffer could, we'll get to Goodman. Stauffer could look at a pile and say, there's a positive correlation. And people, Shirley Starr could look at it. I remember Shirley Starr once walking by and saying, hey, that's a great table. Didn't even notice what the content was. So it was all tabular and very much hand to mouth. Lazarsfeld never had a statistics course in his life. I don't think Pete ever, nobody in the business ever had a statistics course. I had 2 of them, but I didn't do very well in either of them. It was all done on cards. Well, mathematicians and statisticians got interested in this because it has to do with matrices and all kinds of groovy stuff. Leo Goodman, sociologist then at Chicago, now I guess emeritus at Berkeley, developed a very sophisticated, very intricate system of data analysis with tables. Leo, I hadn't thought of this in years. Leo once called me up and said, I'd like a table to look at. And I said, well, sure, what do you want? Oh, a 3x4. He had no interest in what the content was. Anyway, he ginned out in a series of classic papers a very elaborate system. Unfortunately, Leo is perhaps the worst writer in English next to Harrison White, but that's another story. And he is prone to Greek symbols, German symbols, summation signs, the works. But it was good stuff, and of course it was very germane for stuff we were doing. And, oh, when I became director of NORC, Dartmouth was not too pleased, and they made me hold to my contract. So I had to go back 1 year and teach. I had nothing to do long winters in Hanover, New Hampshire, so I studied Goodman. And I felt I got a handle on it. So I wrote a couple of papers. I guess it now would be called The Idiot's Guide to Goodman Techniques. They were published in Sociological Methodology, and it's possible they were a greater contribution to the field than any of the other stuff I mentioned.
So they, at the least, you can think of them as a kind of an analytic rather than a substantive side in which you've made contributions.
Yes, although I've got to add, with the advent of computers, since very fancy computations can be done instantly, tabular analysis is dead. I used to teach a course in tabular analysis. Now I mention it one day in my survey analysis course. I do like to write handouts explaining. I just did a handout on percentage tables for my class this fall. I like to do handouts explaining technical stuff to the troops. Oh, actually, I wrote a textbook called Elementary Survey Analysis, which I haven't looked at in decades. But people come up to me and say, it changed my life.
It was a very popular textbook for a long time, yes.
More.
Well, Jim, I'm going to take and throw you out this general thing. We've talked about your research, your experiences at NORC. What I want to do is give you a chance to say, what else would you like to take and add about your experiences, your career? What haven't we specifically touched upon that comes to you now as something worth sharing with the AAPOR public?
Personally.
Personally, organizationally, disciplinary?
Well, personally, it's been a very good run. I really, except for academic administration, which is a very big exception. Except for that, I get up every morning and have, since the early 50s, been eager to get to work, to see something on the computer, to write something, etc. I've really enjoyed the work. And of course, I've done well. It's made a good living for me, but I find research just incredibly compelling and fascinating. It's kind of like pinball machines. Once you get hooked on, well, SPSS has an NORC connection, but there are millions of good programs. Once you get hooked on, you cannot avoid going like this and seeing whether let's see, what was I looking at? Yeah, is there region? Yesterday morning, is there a big regional difference in original religion? Of course, there is a bit of one, but it's just fascinating, and there is a creativity to. This is what I try to teach in my class. There is a kind of a creativity to looking at this mess of numbers. Just incomprehensible mess, and staring at it and chewing on it, tearing up paper, and suddenly you see a story. And then you want to write it up and tell other people the story. That has been, I've enjoyed that. Any downsides? I feel bad about screwing Dartmouth, but that's not on our agenda today. I should say it has taken me away from my family, but that's not true, because I work at home. I have never punched a button in my office. I use an office to see people, so every day I go to my desk and punch stuff in, and then I watch a lot of children's video on PBS, because we spend the winter in California with our 5-year-old grandson, and he watches PBS cartoons every morning. So I've seen a lot of Bob the Builder and a little bit of SpongeBob
SquarePants.
SpongeBob SquarePants. So
I don't think he's on PBS, though.
Oh, he understands the computer, and I don't. Do I have any professional regrets? I mean, regrets for other people. I regret that sociology has not come together in any way, and that the so-called theorists we read today don't really have anything more to say than the dead theorists of the 19th century. Somehow it's exploded, it's gone off in all directions. But you ask yourself, what does sociology know now we didn't know when Jim Davis started graduate school? The answer is a million facts. Now, when I went to graduate school, nobody knew any facts at all, because there wasn't any research. But we winged it. Now we know everything, but we don't have any central, quote, theoretical ideas. In social change, the closest you can come is age, period, and cohort. What's number 2? Well, we're waiting. So I regret, I don't know, I thought that maybe the GSS would do it, but it did the opposite. Since it's so diffuse, it sends people off in all directions. There's no motivation, because you can always squirrel in on the 3 questions they asked about your whatchamacallit. So of course, I'm not personally responsible for the field of academic sociology. I'm not even responsible for NORC anymore. I'm not entirely responsible. But I do have that regret about the profession.